Hello people of YouTube, it's Deepak here, and welcome to DCS World 2.8.0 and Heat Blur Simulations F-14B Tomcat module. Welcome to Tutorial 5, RIO Radar Employment. Today we're going to go over the employment of the AUG-9 radar, which is the primary sensor on board the F-14B Tomcat, as utilised by the RIO, the backseat crew member, RIO standing for Radar Intercept Officer. Most of the modes of the radar when used for searching and acquiring targets and building up a picture are available to the backseater, the RIO. Pilot has quite limited control over the radar, although as demonstrated in the previous video, he has control over the ACM modes, some of the short-range automated acquisition modes. But today we're going to go over the full employment of the radar as operated by the RIO. Things that we're not going to cover today will be weapons employment and symbology. That will come in a future tutorial. We won't cover the datalink, that will also be covered later. We also won't cover jamming targets or the use of the DCS. This will absolutely be focused down on the AUG-9 radar itself. And as you're going to see, this is quite a complex piece of equipment with quite a lot of displays and controls, so we have our work cut out for us just understanding the basics of operating this radar. So much of what modern air-to-air radars do automatically, this radar actually requires us to fiddle with by hand, although it does have some automation and it does have some track file generation and facilities like that, as you're going to see in a moment. So it's not too basic, but it does require an intelligent, well-trained RIO in order to get the most out of it. So, without any further ado, let's jump into the cockpit, and I will first go over the displays and symbology for the radar. Okay, so you join me in the back seat of the F-14, the RIO's seat in this case, and we're focused down on the top part of his cockpit, which is called the DDD, and that stands for Detailed Data Display. This is one of the primary radar displays in the aircraft, and this is generally used for search, and also it's where many of the controls of the radar are to be found. So before I dive into this, actually, I'm going to just lay out the different areas of the cockpit that we're going to interact with today. Like I said, this whole area up here is the DDD. Next, let's focus down here, and here we have something called the TID, this kind of goldfish bowl looking thing, and that's standing for the Tactical Information Display, and that is where information from track files that we've generated will appear, and the data link and the INS. So we get information about tracks, about waypoint locations, and various other information here on the TID. It has a bunch of controls just underneath here. Next, we're going to be looking at the HCU, or Hand Control Unit, this stick here, and its associated controls across the top and side of this control box. This is the RIO's primary interface with the radar system and the DCS, and this is how we move the cursor, how we hook track files, and all kinds of other stuff. And then down the side here, I'm actually going to hide my pilot body because it's going to get in the way here. If we look down the left-hand console, we have two other panels that I'm going to be covering today. Here, closest to us, is the CAP, which is the Computer Address Panel. This is our primary interface with the WCS, the Weapon Control System. If I move this all the way around to target data, this is the page we're actually going to be using today. This system also allows the running of bit tests and inputting of information to the INS navigational system, and it also allows us to do things with the data link. But today we're only going to use the target data portion. And then here, on the outer side of the left console near the front, we have what is called the Sensor Control Panel. And here we have the controls for the radar's scan volume. So we can set the center of the elevation, the center of the azimuth. We can enable and disable stabilization. We can choose our azimuth scan volume, and we can also change the number of elevation bars that we intend to scan. Controls behind that are for the DCS, which we won't cover today, so we just want this frontal portion here. So now that I've gone over all these different areas, we'll begin actually teaching you how to use the radar. Okay, so taking the DDD display first, or the detailed data display, this is where primary returns from the radar are displayed. So these are like raw radar returns in both the pulse and pulse Doppler modes that the radar has available to it. And we have controls here which will control what is displayed on the DDD exactly. Let's bring the aircraft out of pause, although we're still in active pause just now, and let's have a little look at these controls. First, we have the display controls on the right hand side here, a series of 3 push buttons which control what is actually on the screen here. Radar being the default, so by default we're displaying the radar returns. There's a push button for IR, for infrared. This is actually the old camera system that was present in some F-14As and no longer functions in the F-14B, so this does nothing. Then the third one is the IFF button. If we press and hold this button, we'll actually conduct an IFF scan, although I'll cover exactly how that works a little bit later. Below that you have the primary WCS modes. These are sub-modes for the radar. On the left hand side you've got the 2 single target track modes, the Pulse Doppler STT and the Pulse STT. And then to the right hand side of that are all the different search modes that you can be in. So you've got Pulse Doppler search, range while scan, range while search, in fact, the 2 track while search modes, the auto and the manual, and the pulse search mode, which does just a pure pulse search. So that's how all of this works. You can see the currently enabled mode here. We're currently in TWS Auto, and it's also enunciated by that light being illuminated. I'll go through what each of these modes does exactly after I cover all of the different controls. On the right hand side here we have the closing velocity scale. Normally most of these modes don't actually display range top to bottom, but closure rate, and we can have 4 times the normal closure rate here, or we can have normal. Normally you're going to leave that on the normal. Across the top you have the different controls for controlling the pulse search. You can manually set the range in the pulse search mode using these push buttons, and currently set range will appear in this window here. You've got the antenna track and the RD ROT lights here. If you single target track a target, these 2 will come on to indicate that you have a stable lock. The JAT light will let you know that you're tracking a jamming target, or you're actually locked homing on jam, sorry, with the radar. I'll cover that in a different video. And the IROT would indicate an infrared camera track, but of course the infrared system is no longer in the aircraft. You've got a brightness control here for the display, just so you can get the best possible picture in different lighting conditions, and then you can also adjust how contrasty the actual pulse video is. You might use this if you're getting ground returns and you want to try and tease out some more detail, but most of the time you're going to want this quite high so you can see the returns nicely. The parametric amplifier and the automatic gain controller are not implemented. They don't do anything. MLC allows you to actually enable or disable one of your filters that you have in the Pulse Doppler modes. Pulse Doppler modes implement the notch filter and the zero Doppler filter. You're probably familiar with these from other radar videos, but I will cover them in a little bit of detail later in this video. And you have the ability to effectively disable the notch filter, although at the risk of generating some false returns and other strange stuff on the screen. Target size can be normal, small, or large. This is mainly used in the Pulse Doppler modes. In Pulse Doppler, you've got threshold controls here, but they are not implemented in the sim. In the real aircraft, you could use these to tease some more information out of messy returns. You have the jam jet, so this is basically for filtering jamming contacts better. This is also not implemented. And then you have the ACM thresholds, also not implemented. Push buttons down here for the countermeasures, so like basically anti-jamming modes of the radar. These are also not currently implemented. You've got the elevation display here for the radar down the left hand side, and the TCS system down the right hand side. You can see the radar doing its bar scans here, going through various elevations. And then you can also set the expected aspect of your target, nose, beam or tail, and this will actually just tune the kinds of returns that we're getting. You've also got gain controls for the pulse, and you also have the arrays, which is how quickly targets will disappear when they're scanned. So you can make that quite fast, or you can make it quite slow. And yeah, you're basically just controlling the perseverance of these returns. So that's all the controls on the DDD. Let's now quickly go through what the different modes of the OG9 are as controlled from here. So they're basically broken down into two main categories. You have pulse modes and you also have pulse Doppler modes. Pulse Doppler modes have these two filters, as we discussed. The zero Doppler filter, which filters out contacts that are plus or minus 100 knots of your airspeed. And there's also the notch filter, which also filters out contacts at about the same, but based on ground speed. Both of these filters are designed to avoid the display of ground returns, basically. So it means that you can have a look-down situation and not have the targets completely drowned out by ground returns. Now, of course, this means that if aircraft fly perpendicular to you, or very close to your own airspeed, well, actually it's more closure rate, really, then they may disappear from the screen. And in those situations, you could switch your radar into a pure pulse search mode, where it will display everything. And in fact, let's do that just now. Let's hit pulse search. Pulse search doesn't give you quite as much range as pulse Doppler, because those pulse Doppler filters are allowing us to discern targets at greater ranges. However, it does mean that you can't be notched. So as long as you can make out these contacts, you can kind of work with them and lock them. Let's actually switch the range down to 100. In pulse search mode, you have azimuth across the bottom, and you have range actually top to bottom, and that's rather unusual. Most of the other modes on the DDD are going to display closure rate. The mode that you're going to use the most for picking out long-range targets is in fact pulse Doppler search. Pretty much exactly the same as pulse search, except now we have those filters in place. We're filtering out invalid returns, and we have azimuth and closure rate displayed here on the DDD. The cross in the center being zero closure. Anything displayed above the cross is a positive closure rate, so a little bit above the cross means that we're gaining on them slowly, a lot above the cross means that we're gaining on them very fast. Things below the cross are targets that are getting away from us, and again, a little bit below the cross, they're getting away from us slightly, and then faster and faster and faster all the way down. And we also have this received energy graph at the bottom. So even before we get actual bricks, actual contacts, we can see received radar energy, so we can know that there is probably something on that azimuth. And if we needed to, we could go into pulse search mode, get the raw returns out of that, and decide ourselves if those are aircraft or ground returns or what. So these graphs in the pulse Doppler mode are quite handy for that. So as I said, pulse Doppler search, it's the one that gives you the longest range on your returns. However, it doesn't generate any track files. So information that you generate here is only displayed on the DDD. We don't get track files on the TID, and so this means that we cannot do like TWS launches of the Phoenix or anything like that. However, we can from here transition into a single target track, which could be used for Sparrows and Phoenixes. So the next most common pulse Doppler mode is RWS. That's range while search. This gives you the second best detection range. It generates track files for up to 48 contacts, although you cannot hook them on the TID. We'll cover hooking in just a moment. And this actually displays azimuth and closure rate again here, but it also displays range information on the TID. So we can see here, we've got this target here. We're actually getting a return, a brick on this one here. The radar recognizes that as a contact, although we actually just lost it. And we had a corresponding icon appearing on the TID, giving us the range in effect to that contact. Energy is actually going back up again, so at some point we might pick this guy up again. There he is. You can see we've got an unknown icon appearing here on the TID. We'll cover that a little bit later though, so let's go back to the DDD. The next one is we have two variants of TWS. We have TWS Auto and we have TWS Manual. These modes are the same, with the only difference being that in automatic mode, your azimuth and bar scan are automatically controlled by the WCS in order to keep the currently detected tracks within the radar's scan volume. In manual mode, the RIO is completely responsible for that themselves. TWS can generate 24 track files, so half as many as RWS, but they're of higher quality, and 18 of those can be displayed on the TID, and those contacts, those tracks can be hooked to display further information on the TID, which we'll cover in a little bit later. And the TWS mode can only operate in 2 scan volume modes. So you can have a 20-degree azimuth with 4 bars, or you can have a 40-degree azimuth with 2 bars. Because of the requirement for TWS to generate a target every 2 seconds, or a target return every 2 seconds, you cannot have too big a scan volume. And here you go. We've generated a bunch of returns here, and if I move down, you can actually see that I'm getting targets appearing here on the TID as well. Okay. So, those are all the major modes that you can use the radar in via the DDD. Let's switch now to the TID, and we'll cover how that works. Okay, so looking down here at the TID, or the Tactical Information Display, we're going to be able to see all of the different tracks that we have generated using the OG9 radar. So, just to go over the controls here, let's actually pause it while we have some information on the screen before these things disappear. You've got controls on the left-hand side here for the INS system, so these are not really related to the use of the radar and lights that are in relation to that. You've got the contrast and brightness controls across the top. You have a window here which will tell you what information is being displayed on the data block across the top of the screen. Currently its own aircraft position information, and I'll show you in a moment how to make that change. Steering information is currently basically the steering cues that are being displayed to the pilot. Currently it says LD collision. This is basically giving the pilot collision steering to the the highest priority target at the current time. You also can choose your INS destination here, your waypoint number and so on, using these controls. We've got a push button on the left here to do TID track hold. Normally tracks are dumped after 14 seconds of not being able to see them on the radar. This, when it's illuminated, extends that to 2 minutes, which may or may not be useful in certain situations. You then also have the collision steering button. This will give the pilot collision steering to the currently hooked target, and that's something we'll demonstrate in just a moment. You've got display controls across the bottom box here. I'll actually unpause so we can quickly demonstrate those. The very first one is ground stabilized mode. In ground stabilized mode, our aircraft is at the center of the display, with the radar scan volume being shown as these 2 lines, left and right, and our velocity vector is displayed here as well. In this mode, I'll bump out the range so we can see a little bit better. The velocity vectors, these lines that are coming out of these different tracks, are absolute velocity. So this is the actual absolute speed of these aircraft. Whereas if we're in aircraft stabilized mode, it's always our aircraft at the bottom of the screen and our flight path kind of going straight up the middle, and these lines then become the relative velocity, or in fact closure rate, of these aircraft in relation to our aircraft. We've got range controls here on the right hand side, by the way, for this one. And then also if we go into attack mode, it's exactly the same as aircraft stabilized, but with additional information such as the horizon line, and we would also have weapon queuing information, which we're not going to cover today. Last option is the TV. This displays the TCS video, which also we're not going to cover today. I'm going to bring it back to aircraft stabilized. We then have declutter controls as push buttons across the bottom here. We've got the TID reject image, which has no function. We can display or hide the altitude number. If I pause quickly, you'll see that on the left-hand side of each of these aircraft, we have a number. This is their altitude in tens of thousands of feet, rounded down to the closest 0, which is a really weird system, if you ask me. We're used to, in most numerical systems, rounding up and rounding down. This will round up or down, depending on which is the direction to get to the closest 0 as the second digit, if that makes sense. So for example, let's say this target here is at, let's say that it's at 14,000 feet. It's rounding it down to 1 for 10,000 feet, but this actually could also be 8,000 feet. Or 6,000 feet even, and it would round it up to 10,000. It's always going to round it towards the closest 0. So to get 0 here, you would have to be below 5,000 feet, if that makes sense. So it's kind of a weird system, but once you get used to it, it's not so bad. We also have symbology elimination. So if I click that, it actually removes all the symbols and just displays the little bricks again, basically. Let's bring that back. You can display or not display datalink information, so that would be the bottom half of the HAFUs. You can display or not display jamming strobes. Those are now implemented in the F-14, but I'll cover them in a different video. And we can also switch to non-attack targets not being displayed. So basically, if I turn this off, only hostiles will be displayed. We haven't actually decided what these are yet. You can display or not display launch zones. This will replace the velocity vector of the target with the maximum range at which we can engage them. If this line were to touch our own ship, that would mean we're in maximum range. And then there's also the ability to display or hide the velocity vector, which is fairly obvious on that one. Let's bring this range down a little bit just now, just to keep these guys in view. Next thing is, like I said, we've got these lines that are showing the scan volume from a top-down orientation. Each of these dashed lines is 20 nautical miles, so it allows you to estimate ranges fairly well. Each gap is also 20 nautical miles, so it's 20, 20, 20, so we can guess these guys are about 50 nautical miles away. We'd actually set the range to 50, and that would kind of confirm it. Other things to note, on the left-hand side, we have scan volume information. So we have the maximum altitude that we're scanning within this scan volume, 35,000 feet, minimum, which is ground level, and we have the current antenna elevation. We've got a down angle of 2.1. Across the top, we've got the data block. These two sets of numbers here simply show the computer is running. They're computer run indications. They can be ignored. This is the INS primary mode. We're currently in INS navigation. And also if we had a weapon selected, it would be enunciated here, just below the navigational mode. So that's all the basic information. We then have symbols. This diagonal symbol here with the dot is a waypoint, and it has a number 1, so that's waypoint 1. This is an ambiguous or unknown target, because he's got the square staple. If he was triangular, he would be an enemy. If he had a rounded appearance, then he would be a friendly. And that's how we discern all of that. Next thing that I'm going to cover is the HCU, because this won't take us too much to cover. It's the hand controller unit. Primarily what you're going to use with this is to move cursors, and then it has a trigger on the front which has a half action and a full action. Pushing the trigger to half action will enable the cursor, so I'm going to do that now. You can see I've got this little circle, and I can move this circle around in the display. Doing a full action would allow me to select something, and I'm actually going to pause very quickly because you can see that in the window at the top we can see the data block changed. It changed to target number 1, and you can see that we now have a bunch of information appearing up here. We have the altitude of the target, so no, sorry, the range, in fact. Let me check my notes because I'm getting this wrong now. We have the range. So he is currently 23.2 nautical miles away. We have his current bearing, which is showing at 337. We have his altitude. So as I said, although he's just about at 15,000 feet, it's still rounding down to 10. So we're showing 10. He's actually at 14,916 feet. And we would then have the closure rate on the right-hand side here, which is 700 knots. And we can see his direction of travel relative to us because we're in aircraft stabilized mode here. So if I unpause, we can see him continue to move, and I could actually click my collision steering button here, and we'd see that we're giving the pilot collision steering to this particular target. I'm going to deactivate that just now. And if I do half action, then I actually drop the hook on that target, and we're back to own ship information, and the collision steering is disabled. Other things to note is that we can control what the hand controller controls. We have it currently on TID cursor, which is why we're removing that. If I switch to DDD cursor, it works in basically the same mode, but now if I do a half action and move this... Oh, I'm in TWS auto, I can't do that. If I go to manual, or is it pulse Doppler? Nope, none of these are working. Why can't I control my cursor? DDD cursor. Or do I have to have it in radar? Ah, yes, of course. I got mixed up between DDD cursor and the actual pulse Doppler, the radar cursor. So you need to have it in radar mode, and then you can control the cursor on the DDD here. As I move this, it's actually moving the antenna, by the way. So I know that my targets are over here somewhere. So I can move my cursor over here, and if I do a full action, it will attempt to lock at that location, but I didn't pick anything up. What we can do with the DDD cursor, which was the one I used accidentally there, is if we were in pulse search mode with a set range, and if we go into DDD cursor, we then have the ability to actually designate a point on the ground for doing a position fix. So here I get this cross. If I do a half action, I can move the cross around, and if I do a full action, I set a point on the ground using the radar, and this would normally be used for INS position fixes. I'm going to come out of that cursor mode now and back to the radar cursor. I'm going to put it back in PD search. The last HCU mode that we have at the top here is for the TCS. So if I switch my TID to TV and I have my HCU in the TCS mode, I can do a half action and then I can move my TCS camera manually. And if I was to do a full action, I would attempt a contrast lock using the TCS. Anyway, let's pop that back into the TID cursor. Other controls that we have down here is we have the power switch for the TCS. It has 3 positions: off, standby, and on. And then you have the same thing for the WCS. It can be in off, standby, and transmit. If I move this back into standby, the radar and all the systems are still powered. Let's actually bring this back. But you can see we have absolutely no radar returns. Let's pop it back into transmit. And actually, let's put the radar back into TWS Auto so we can more easily build up a picture here. And we will start to see radar returns once more. It can take up to 8 seconds for the system to actually start generating track files. And it can take a bit of time for us to actually start picking up targets. Okay, now that I've got some track files displayed on the radar, I'm going to demonstrate determining whether these are friend or foe. So I'm in TWS Auto here. I'm going to push the 100 nautical mile range, and I'm going to push and hold my IFF switch. And while I'm getting returns on that, I'm going to pause very quickly so we can take a little look at this symbology. So I've gotten 2 returns here. One is basically directly on the nose and one off to the right. You'll see that the one on the nose here has 2 bars, a bar above and below it. That means that it's giving a valid IFF response, so that's a friendly. And then this one here is giving no response whatsoever, and that means that he is almost certainly hostile. Now currently my scan volume is off to the right, which is why I'm probably not actually generating a track file for this one. But we know that this contact here is hostile, so let's go about identifying that as a hostile contact. With the HCU in TID cursor mode, what we're going to do is we're going to hook this target first, so let's come out of pause, half action on the HCU, full action on this particular aircraft, and we're getting all of its information on the information block at the top. We're then going to take a little look at the CAP, the computer address panel. With it in target data mode, we have options for friend, unknown, and hostile. We're going to choose hostile. And if we look back here, we'll see now that this particular contact has the hostile HAFU symbol. I'm going to half action again and then full action away from him, and we can now see that he is no longer actually being displayed on the data block at the top. So that's how you do it. Press and hold IFF, wait for the IFF returns, and then identify the target tracks as friendly or hostile on the TID. Lastly, we're going to cover one last panel that we haven't covered so far, the sensors control panel, and here is where we can do manual control of the radar. So just now I'm in TWS Auto. This won't work in TWS Auto. You need to be in PD Search, RWS, TWS Manual, or Pulse Search. If I look down here now, I can now set my azimuth scan as 10, 20, 40, or 65 degrees left and right. I can sweep the radar left or right of center, or I can put it back to the center. I have the elevation control here, and this is best used when referencing the TID here. You can see the angle in the middle. If I move this, I can angle the radar up or down. I'm going to reset it back to about middle, and then we can choose the number of elevation bars. I'm going to drop us down to a 2-bar scan, but it has options for 1, 2, 4, and 6. Note that when you go to TWS Auto, after about 8 seconds, these will be overridden. Okay, and let's just put the whole thing together. Let's lock up a target. I'm going to go to radar cursor mode. We've got this guy on the right. We've confirmed him hostile. I'm going to go half action, move over him. I've got the cursor on him. full action, radar attempt to lock, and we now have a single target track on that particular target. We'd lost the track at some point, so he's back to ambiguous. I'm going to go ahead and identify him hostile, and we're now ready to engage this target. I'm going to pop us into collision steering here. And you can see antenna track and flashing RD/ROT. That means we have a stable lock on that target, and we can see the data block is enunciating target 1 over here. So that is all the basics of operating the OG-9 radar as the RIO in the back seat of the F-14B. I hope that you all enjoyed that. If you haven't already, please subscribe, like, and comment. It's a really big help to me and the channel. If you'd like to join Deepak's ground crew, there is a join button below, which will allow you to do that. Big shout out to the current members of Deepak's ground crew: Frantic Stone, Channel Right, Storm Kimbari, Byron Farrow, Leo Netzel, Harish Rajan, Mangash, Pink Floyd, J.R. Walker, Chandro Hedgewald, and Griff Nizzle. Thank you very much to all of you, and thank you very much to all my subscribers for your support. See you all next time, and fly safe.